Hello, everybody. Now, these days, universities around the world are trying to switch online. They are trying to reproduce things they used to do offline in an online environment. And that's important. Universities cannot afford to simply close down for several months. They need to keep going, right? But at the same time, I think it's good to use this epidemic as an opportunity to think about why exactly we are doing what we are doing, why we have these practices and not some other practices in research universities in general, and in SAS in particular. So I'm going to do several interventions in this direction myself, and I'm welcoming everybody to join me to comment on what I'm going to say or to make their own interventions about these general principles of universities. I think it will be great if we emerge back to the offline world with a better understanding of what exactly we should be doing at SAS and in universities in general. And the topic of today's intervention is the Great Conversation. The term Great Conversation was proposed by Robert Hutchins in 1952. Robert Hutchins was a philosopher of education, but he is also famous because he was the president and the chancellor of the University of Chicago. The University of Chicago is a very special university, and I think its intellectual identity is due to a large extent to Robert Hutchins' influence. In this essay, he speaks about Western tradition of great conversation. He says that, well, the West, or Western civilization, is very special and unique in the world because it has these thousands of years of great conversation, where thinkers, starting from antiquity to the present day, actually continue the conversation about many important fundamental problems. And for him, the university is a member of this great conversation. It's actually the main function of the university is to participate in this great conversation, both in terms of its research, in terms of the faculty that participate in the conversation, and students who get involved in the great conversation. For him, this is what education, he calls it liberal arts education, is all about. For example, he says, I quote, "The aim of liberal education is human excellence, both private and public. It regards man as an end, not as a means, and it regards the ends of life, not the means to it. Other types of education or training treat man as means to some other end, or at best concerned with the means of life, with earning a living, and not with its ends." That's an end of quote. So he immediately juxtaposes education as something about the ends of life to vocational training, which is about the means of life. And for him, the real education is about ends of life. Vocational education is important also, but it might come at a later stage. It's specific, right? Different people need different vocational training, but there is something that everybody needs. And this is this education that talks about the ends of life. He says that liberal arts is not merely indispensable, they are unavoidable. Nobody can decide for himself whether he is going to be a human being, right? You can decide if you want to be an engineer, or if you want to be an economist, or if you want to be a writer, but you cannot decide to be a human being. You already are a human being. And therefore, I continue the quote, the only question open to him is whether he will be an ignorant, undeveloped one, or one who has sought to reach the highest point he is capable of attaining. End of quote. Now, the next question is how to get students involved in this great conversation. You can do it by actually inviting students to argue with philosophers, for example, on day one. And I had a student at Berkeley once who was a first-year student who wrote an essay on Plato, saying that Plato doesn't understand anything about society because Plato says that society is, quote, and in fact, look, around California is very different. Of course, this is an extreme case, but in a way, if you involve a person in the conversation simply saying, well, your point of view is just as important as Plato's point of view, you put them in the situation of this conversation, but it's not a great conversation. It hardly allows you to bring the student to this point of great attainment that Hutchins wants us to achieve. Right? The opposite strategy would be to really require students to learn a lot before they can actually express their own views and polemicize with Plato or I don't know how anybody else about important issues. And that would be a more European and Russian, in this case, approach, where you first study the history of philosophy, you study the great conversation as it was developing without you, and only when you've studied all that, you can actually participate yourself. The problem with this approach is that it never happens often, right? That you just memorize things, you study the history of something, and then you graduate from the university already without having started to participate in the conversation yourself. Actually, Hutchins, I think, has a solution to this dilemma in this essay. Because when he speaks about university, he doesn't speak about just one thing. He speaks about different methods that exist within universities. And these methods are different for different disciplines. He says that, I quote, "The liberally educated man understands, by understanding the distinctions and interrelations of the basic fields of the subject matter, the differences and connections between poetry and history, science and philosophy, theoretical and practical science. He understands that the same methods cannot be applied to all these fields. He knows the methods appropriate to each." End of quote. So for Hutchins, the great conversation, something that makes it great, something that makes universities indispensable to the great conversation and different from, let's say, a church, a political party, or any other institution, is that it's a theoretically grounded comprehension of the world, which has disciplinary specificity and which also has the possibility of bringing this all together. That's why we call university a university, from universal. That gives you a solution to the dilemma of, can we actually invite students to participate in the conversation right away, or can we ask them to delay this participation indefinitely? The solution is that you should invite them right away, but at the same time, you should require that this conversation is theoretically grounded, that there is a method, that there is an understanding of a method of a particular discipline addressing a particular set of problems, and that this method is reflected upon. And I think this kind of reflection is what sets University of Chicago aside. University of Chicago used to have a T-shirt that students were just wearing, which said, "It's all very well and good in practice, but how does it work in theory?" Which is a paradoxical statement, right? Usually we say, well, in theory it's okay, but how about practice? In Chicago and in Hutchins' tradition, it's the other way around, right? An important statement is only an important solution, only works if it works in theory. The fact that it works in practice is irrelevant. The important thing is that there is a theoretical framework in which it makes sense. And this is a way to really enter the great conversation, which in Hutchins' view is the ultimate goal of the university. Whether or not we should consider it the ultimate goal of SAS as well is a question I invite everybody to discuss and reflect upon. Thank you.